I saw a hand motion. I couldn't see what it was. Yes, all right, fantastic. So I guess we'll get going here. My name is Daniel Ritchie. I work for Broadridge Financial Solutions. This is my Twitter handle. I don't have a whole lot to say about this right now, but if you want to tweet at me during this or afterwards, I will follow up for sure. So today we're going to cover a few different things. Of course, the introduction, myself, my company, give you a background about what we think DevOps should be within Broadridge, and also dig into the approach that we have a little bit as well. So that's the high level, but let's get into it. So some important things. We're going to talk about how to empower teams to be effective. We're going to look at what DevOps is really at its core, or finding ways to find out what it means to us and what it means to you. We're going to talk a little bit about deployment orchestration. This isn't about release orchestration. This isn't about the big picture pipeline. We're going to focus mostly on that aspect. And although this will be somewhat cloud-focused, it really is a universal approach. And you can apply this not only to the cloud, but to other aspects as well. So again, we won't go into details for CI or CD. We're going to kind of expect that you're doing those things. And we're not going to have a discussion about tools and a strong opinion about what our tool set is. We will, of course, mention some tools, but please keep an open mind regardless. I'll try to highlight individuals who have been supportive of our journey and have inspired a lot of what we're doing. If I miss anyone or if I misquote anyone, I will correct it later on. So give me some leeway there. But I want to highlight that this is not something that we came up with entirely on our own. Of course, we branded it and made it our own. But this really is leveraging a lot of other well-established approaches. So if you don't know who Broadridge is, it's not a surprise. This headline is 5 years old. I've been at the company for 7.5 years, and I think in that entire time I've met 5 people who have even heard of the company. So if you look at the fancy text that we have, basically we cover a lot of different things in the financial services industry. What do we have here? Let's see, communications, technology, data, analytics solutions, and advanced being an important word there. Well, what does that actually mean? I won't go over all these things, but just touch on a few things. We process more than 80% of the outstanding shares in the US and more than half globally, so that basically gives us a monopoly. We have 2 billion, better than 2 billion investor communications that are sent out. That's millions of pieces of mail per day. Let's see, 10 out of the top 10 clients are ours in the banking industry. 5 trillion a day in assets are processed, and we're basically worldwide. So all the things behind the scenes in the financial services industry that nobody else really wants to do, we've found a way to capitalize on that and take advantage of the need to leverage technology in that space. So this means we have print facilities, of course. A large part of our business is around proxy and mailings. This is one of our facilities that we have. We have multiple facilities like this. It's kind of interesting. One of our technology centers is located next to this facility. So depending on which way you go in the hallway, it's either a bunch of cubicles or this. Of course, we have a lot of hardware that allow these things to happen. Many of our products are a result of acquisitions or in mergers, and a lot of times we bring those teams and even the hardware along in some cases. So that means we have not only this print facility and the technical aspect of what we do, but the physical hardware as well can be something to consider. We've been around for a long time. I found this yesterday. This is a real posting within our company. This is a headline from May. So we cover the gamut, and it really is old school hardware, legacy implementations, and really cutting edge technology that isn't just hopes and dreams for us. We're really doing it. So from a perspective of a shared services group that cuts across all aspects, all verticals of the business, and provides technical services, we have a pretty significant challenge. There are obviously a lot of opinions, a lot of very different opinions, and it's hard to find a way to meet needs of everyone. I'm going to give my boss a new title, the cat herder in chief. He's here today, so thanks for joining us, Brett. I want to highlight him because, like I said, I've been at the company for 7.5 years, and when we started talking about DevOps in the enterprise, nobody really wanted to talk about it. We were accused of being black ops, and if we were successful, we were going to take away everyone's jobs and all these other ridiculous things. And Brett understood very early on that this was something that would be important for the enterprise and was an advocate for us really from the beginning, and that's why this is really his program that he has made possible. I want to highlight, another reason that he's successful is this is what he looks like on Halloween. Try working for that guy, gosh. I want to highlight Rajiv as well, who's in the audience. When we first started working with Rajiv, I really struggled. We wanted to do, really lean methodology and quit bothering us with project details and other things. And it became very apparent that having an advocate who really understood the enterprise and could be an ambassador for us and a point of communication was absolutely essential. So don't discount people who are approaching things in a way that you don't necessarily agree with. You absolutely need them to gain the political territory that's necessary to be effective in doing these things within the enterprise. Oh, and sorry, I want to highlight also, Rajiv found out during this conference that he went to school with one of the co-founders of CloudBees. We didn't know that until yesterday. And then there's me. I've, like I said, been with the company for 7.5 years. I came from really a QA background in automation. Even though I started in business, I knew I wanted to get an understanding of technology, and I became a technologist about 12 years ago and have just really ran with it since then. I was very conflicted today as to whether I would need to get dressed up or be very casual, and I didn't think the devs would take me seriously if I put a suit on, so here I am. So my DevOps journey started probably in 2012 or 2013 when I started to hear the hoofbeats in the distance and realized that something was happening which was very significant and would have a very substantial impact for anyone who took advantage of it. This is the first DevOps days that I went to, and these are some of the people that I was with. I didn't know at the time, but a little idea is Andrew Clay Schaefer, who, if you've seen Damon Edwards' short history of DevOps, was the first person to show up for the DevOps talk that Patrick Dudois didn't go to. And I actually had a lot of conflict with Andrew during this event because I was thinking in the very typical enterprise way of how do we shoehorn this DevOps thing into the enterprise. And Andrew kept telling me I was wrong and I needed to think about it differently. And I struggled with it a lot, but I'm really appreciative of those interactions because it helped shape and define a lot of what we're doing within Broadridge. So his definition, his very early definition, this is from 2010, of what DevOps is a global community of practice. And tell that to your boss, right? We want to adopt DevOps. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But he boiled that down into two key aspects. The first was just a recognition that development and operations can and should work together. These are completely his words. I'm totally plagiarizing here. And also that we have a lot of change that's happening in this space. These things are still extremely true today. So I think he really did identify the essence of what DevOps was. I want to highlight one of the first things that I heard when I got my first real job. This was, I guess, back in 2006. A good friend of mine at the time, who I actually need to circle back and reach out to, we're at the office, and I was trying to understand automation and how all these computer things fit together and technology. He was a proficient technologist, and he reminded me that all of these things, he was really adamant about it, all of these things are happening on a personal level, right? We have these computers, we have these very powerful systems, we can put process and everything in place, but it's really all about the people who are a part of this that make it what it is. I've revisited this comment many times. I don't know who to attribute this to, but the idea that it's people, process, tools in that order, Originally, I thought that was first tackle the people, then build out a process, and then establish tools. But that's evolved for me, and it's now more about making sure that people are the driving force behind everything that you do. If you lose the people at any point, you really need to go back and revisit everyone that you're working with and make sure that they're comfortable with the approach and on board with everything that's happening. And that's because they are the experts. At a large enterprise especially, you have so many people that are coming together to deliver a solution that it's not really possible or reasonable to try to control each and every one of them. What you really need to do is find something that they approve of, that they buy into, and that they can implement. You've hired really talented, effective people for good reason, and if you don't leverage them, you're really kind of going in the wrong direction, I think. So always come back to your people and make sure you're providing a solution that works for them as well. And I have to apologize, I'm going to just grab my phone so I can have the time close by here. Okay, so this is a cloud native track, and we want to talk about cloud. Why did we look at cloud? Well, especially in an enterprise that has a lot of long-established workflows and practices, it's really difficult to find a way to elbow in. If you want to introduce a new workflow or a new tool, you're going to have a small army who has an opinion of the selection that they went with years ago, and they will also potentially feel threatened by whatever you're introducing. There's a lot of opportunity within cloud. In our case, we had executive mandate that dictated that this was something that we absolutely needed to implement. We, of course, see the benefits of the cloud, and it's an incredibly fast-paced environment that there's a lot of things that are changing and becoming available. So there's a lot of territory. And for that reason, not only can you establish kind of a greenfield project, you also don't have to worry about the political concerns that you'll face and the resistance that you'll face in a lot of other ways. So you can solve problems that are outstanding without offending or stepping on toes of others that are involved. Let's go with a natural choice here and walk through a quick example of very high level what our experience was when we started down this road. So of course, Amazon, a leader in this space. So maybe you pick up their tool set and you find a few that you really like, and it makes sense, and you start building out your product, and then you realize there's some other interesting things that you can leverage that they have as well. So you start onboarding those and plugging those aspects in, and of course, some of those are proprietary, and now you're locked in, but it's really cool, so you're into it anyways, and you keep running with this, and they keep releasing more tools, and you find more interesting things. And then they release even more tools. This was from February of this year. I don't know what the real number is today, but it's a lot to keep up with. And this is just with Amazon. We're not even talking about anyone else at this point. So you've done all this, and then you're told that you need to be multi-region because you have to now support the possibility of lift and shift or redundancy that's cross-region. And Amazon's great, and there's a lot, but it's not the only cloud, and now you have to be multi-cloud. And oh, by the way, you also have all this old infrastructure, which, thanks to IBM, now can run Docker containers. So this just kind of keeps going, and it gets totally out of control. And keeping up with that is very difficult when you have an inflexible solution for connecting your people to the solving these problems. So I talked to the cloud native interactive CNCF, I can't remember what they're called, Computing Foundation, Cloud Native Computing Foundation. Talked to them today, and at their booth, they had a printout, and they said, well, that's not even current. You have to go to our website to see what the current one is. And I don't know if you can read this at the top there, but this represents 579 products and almost 16 billion worth of investment for just cloud native solutions. And only a small handful of these are really considered prime time at the moment. So some of these are going to be the next Kubernetes or something else that we can't even imagine at this point. So how do you then navigate all of these things? How do you figure out which of these tool sets you need to choose and what implementations are correct? It comes back to your people. right? You have experts who know these things. You've hired them for good reason, and they are going to navigate these waters for you because they are specialists and they have specific focus in the areas that you hired them for. And if they aren't solving your needs, then you'll hire someone else who does solve that need, and completing the picture that you have that you need to work with. So empowering those individuals seems challenging and a little bit scary, but the reality is almost every product has the ability to integrate with other solutions, and they offer programmatic interfaces that give you the opportunity to plug them into other things. I can almost guarantee that every vendor that is out in the hall will tell you, oh yes, we can integrate with that, or oh yes, we have a solution for that. So even though there's this kind of frighteningly large and diverse landscape of opportunity for developers to go and choose specific tools, if that's the right tool for the job and that's what they choose to do, there's probably a way to think about integrating it later. But you don't want to have it be the Wild West either. So we'll get into how to prevent that as well in a little bit here. But the important part is don't try to constrain the tool selections that your experts have chosen, because they are going to know what's best for them. And within a large organization, we have standards and practices that keep them away from the rails as well. So we've been thinking a lot about how do we allow for that broad flexibility without just letting them just run free and do things that are potentially dangerous or reckless or out of the bounds of what you would want to have within an organization. And there is this conflict between autonomy, allowing them to do whatever they want to do, and then constraint, making sure you keep them within bounds that are appropriate for your enterprise. So I'm not sure if I'm attributing this correctly, but this is from the Spotify walkthrough that they have published, where, and we found this to be very true. If people are doing the right things and they're moving in the right direction, you feel really comfortable saying, that's fine. You know where the limits are, and you know how to avoid those limits, so go do whatever you need to do now that you have that figured out. So alignment really is the key to autonomy, and how do you make sure that everyone's on the same page and pulling in the same direction? You know, we talked about the ancient ships that would go off into faraway lands and claim them to be their own. I'm not advocating for that or saying it's a good thing, but you could have Britain or France or whoever it was walk away for hundreds of years in some cases and come back and still claim that territory as their own. That is not necessary. I mean, it can be a very heavy-handed approach that allows that to happen, but how do you have autonomy while still having the alignment? So we've come up with a little catchy buzzword, maybe it's catchy, we'll find out, to describe what we're trying to do here, and that's constrained autonomy. Our example that we've used to describe this internally is it's like building a highway system, right? We understand that we want to connect New York and Los Angeles and a lot of points in between, but we don't necessarily have to describe how that happens. We're going to create the highway, we're going to set the speed limits, but if you want to drive a Ferrari or a tractor-trailer truck or a pickup truck or a sedan, that's completely up to you, right? We have very high-level limits that we apply, and we lay a foundation that allows you to get where we think you need to be, but otherwise you have the ability to decide where you want to go. And very few people that drive a car are thinking, oh, I feel really restricted in where I'm going. You just feel like you have the freedom when you're behind the wheel to decide where you want to go. And that's the same kind of thing that we want to give to our engineers across the organization. So what does this maybe look like? Here's another example. We'll call this constraint. Okay, maybe we've got a row of developers and a row of operations here. Highly restrictive, not ideal, right? This is a low autonomy, low alignment, or maybe even high alignment environment. And nothing's changing here. So you think, well, let's just allow them to be free, right? Let them run around. Well, yes, but you've just made the cage a bit bigger, and it's still not really the ideal approach. So what we want is this idea of a much bigger fence where it doesn't feel like constraint. It doesn't appear to be constraint, and there's a lot of flexibility to do the things that the developers or the engineers would like to do within the organization. Now, you still provide the home base. You still put up a fence to keep them within bounds, but you're not trying to restrict all the things. You're trying to find a way to allow them to be free within some constraint. So constrained autonomy, maybe we'll be a little fun here and call it pasture-raised DevOps. Another way to think about this. So a few tips for fostering alignment. At an enterprise, you have a very difficult position, especially if you're supporting cross-functional teams, of bringing together disparate teams that otherwise might not even interact with each other. So building alliances is really critically important. Finding out what the motivations and drivers are for others within your organization that you may not have a responsibility for their territory, but you can influence what they're doing. So finding out what their needs are and aligning yourself with those needs is very important. Also encouraging pockets of innovation. An enterprise is already notoriously slow at affecting change, and you really don't want to get in the way of that. You want to find ways to say, okay, this team over here is doing something that we like, and even if they're competitive with your goals and priorities, as long as they're aligned in your vision, it's really helpful to kind of seed those pockets and help them grow independently, because you are going to need them as advocates as well. We also facilitate community. We host a monthly community of practice meeting for DevOps where we say everybody in the organization, from boots on the ground all the way up to executives that have an interest in DevOps, let's just get together in an open forum. And I mean, of course, there's structure to it, but we want to bring everyone onto the same page and give them an opportunity to kind of casually make this their own. Of course, we have user groups for specific technologies, as well as events like DevOps Days that we host internally. And also, we are a team that can provide real direct support. So others will come to us and say they have a specific need, and we can offer our resources to help them out there. At the end of the day, it comes down to building trust in all directions. I was going to say building trust in both directions, but the reality is you have a multifaceted solution where you have teams from multiple silos that need to work together. So you need to be sure that whatever they're doing is something that you trust is the right thing to do. And they also need to have trust in you that when you're sending them in a direction that you're not going to get them in trouble with the organization, that you're going to provide the space that they need to be safe, and that you're not going to have the foxes come and attack whatever they're doing, right? The strength that you'll have as a centralized aspect of your organization will be something that others will need to follow, and giving them the leverage that you have is something that can be helpful to them, and they will trust the direction that you're going as well. So trying to come up with real examples of what this looks like is challenging, so I'm going to provide just some really high-level ideas behind how we have constrained autonomy within Broadridge. For version control systems, we have a lot. This is just a handful of ones within the organization. We just want to see that you're in source control. We won't dictate which source control repository that you use. And then, of course, from there, you can set up good CI practices and have builds and validations occur. Again, we don't particularly care what CI tool you choose. We have a very large part of the organization that uses a CI tool that we did not implement, which is not Jenkins, but they're established, it works, and it keeps the wheels turning. It would be reckless of us to ask them to lift and shift onto our platform just because we wanted alignment in this way. So these are not tools that are critically important. What is important is that they produce an artifact that we can consume for deployment. We don't care how it gets produced. We don't care what tools are used to produce it, but we require that that artifact does exist. Of course, we want to see that artifact be deployed to test hardware. And if you're using infrastructure as code, you'll be able to provision that hardware. And if you're using good CI/CD practices, you're going to be validating that as well. And then you're going to need somewhere to store this. This is really the first milestone that we set where we require teams to meet a gate that we put in place. And we'll just pick Nexus for no particular reason. They were giving out really nice mugs, if you didn't notice that. So what are the constraints that really matter? There's a lot of great orchestration tools that are available today. A lot of tools that will abstract a lot of the process and make it very simple to interact with these things. In our case, as a company that provides technical solutions, we had a lot of technologists within the organization who we could entrust to do some very heavy lifting technical things. So it wasn't important for us to have a overly simplified UI or an overly simplified process that they could interact with, because we did have technologists interacting with our process. So it wasn't a critical constraint for us to use a specific tool. And we didn't want to restrict anyone to any specific tool, because again, we wanted developers and engineers to have the flexibility to explore what the best solution was. So it brought us to a question of what is our purpose? And we thought a lot about deployment automation and focusing on just deploying or just automating everything. Well, that's great and it's beneficial, but automation has been around for a very long time, and it's not something that is novel. It's something that's helpful. It's something that you can measure the outcome of fairly easily, and I would recommend it. But it's not necessarily the thing that we need to focus on. Also, just because you have automation doesn't mean you're solving the right problems in the right way. So automation wasn't really the right place to focus for all of this. And then we created a center of excellence. And we feel very strongly that there is a lot of value in a center of excellence, and we think we would even recommend a center of excellence. But it's critically important that you don't attempt to be the one and only definition of DevOps or to create a new definition of DevOps. What you need to do is find ways, because if you do that, of course, this is what it sounds like to everyone that you're trying to give to them. What you really need to do is find a way to foster the growth of DevOps within others within your organization. I think this is really why we exist within Broadridge, and the value that we offer within Broadridge is really about helping others become more successful. We don't want just one small aspect of the organization to be highly effective. We want everyone to be highly effective, and when we have more than 10,000 employees, it's very challenging to affect change at scale. So really focus on building others up to be successful in their own ways, and the center of excellence should be something that allows a reference point for the organization, and you really need to be experts that the organization looks up to as a point of reference for where you need to go. So if you're not doing it that way, it might feel like you're trying to shove this DevOps thing into the enterprise, and it really isn't what it's all about. DevOps is about fostering the growth within others that are going to be successful implementing these things. Just the cloud-native landscape, almost 600 new tools that have not yet come to market. There's $16 billion of investment in those, just in the cloud-native landscape. There's a lot of other technology out there. You have a lot of people in a large enterprise who know what they're doing. Help them understand how they can be the most effective. So if you try to implement any type of tooling, it really needs to be relatively hands-off. In our case, transparent. It can't affect what's happening too much. Of course, having it be community-oriented is ideal. It needs to be extensible because there's a lot of new things coming out, and in our case, a lot of different things that need to be, different problems that need to be solved. So having the ability to support those broad integrations was also critically important for us. So how do we actually implement this? We talked a lot about concepts. We'll just touch on it a little bit here, but I wanted to give you something a little more tangible than all of this. So at that DevOps Days I mentioned in Ljubljana, I was asking how we do these things. And I was asking the group, we have technical teams deployment teams, shared services teams who are very opinionated about the way they do things. And we have developers who are doing DevOps in a really exciting way. How do we get the two together without the animosity? And she said, just hug each other. That doesn't work for an enterprise, but it helped me understand the key to a lot of this, which is the people. You're working with other real people, and it can't be antagonistic. You can't be forcing anything upon them. So you need to find a way to give them that constrained autonomy. So I came up with an enterprise version of that, which is semi-autonomous cross-functional orchestration, allowing those different teams to explore the space that they need to be highly effective independently, but also finding ways to bring all of that together. And this becomes more compounded when different parts of your organization are at different levels of maturity. You can't easily shoehorn a team that is brand new to the idea of continuous delivery into another team that is deploying blockchain to the cloud. You have to find a way to bring them all together, and that is very challenging. So we offer two approaches, an opinionated model and a non-opinionated model that both are underneath one consistent workflow. So for the opinionated approach, we did come up with a tool set, all the way from source control to deployment orchestration, everything we needed to provision hardware, configure, do the automated configuration, and deploy software. We established patterns and practices around that. We provided direct support for people who wanted to take on what we offered. And then we disseminated that widely. And we said, this is the way that you do these things. But within that, there were always very high-level milestones that we set. And we allowed for a second strategy, which was unopinionated. As long as they met the important goals, for example, ensuring that we had an artifact in a repository, an artifact repository, we didn't care what tools they used or how they got there. We gave them a lot of flexibility in making that decision. And we kept asking ourselves, is what we were doing fit for purpose? And again, in this case, our purpose is not to put restrictions in place. Of course, it's to be prudent and measured within a large organization. And in financial services, we have to be concerned with security and governance and a lot of other important aspects. But our purpose was really to help a large organization become highly effective. And that meant getting the people that were doing these things together. We aren't a third party coming in and becoming a new silo within the organization. We need to take existing parties within the organization and bring them together so they can be effective. So of course, we're here at a CloudBees conference, and we really did believe that Jenkins was the appropriate solution. We had dozens of instances around the organization, both for development and operations. Even when it was Hudson, we had enterprise support. It's a highly dynamic tool. I love this image. You can use it for so many different things. Sky's the limit, I think, really, when it comes to how Jenkins is leveraged. And it's also engineer-centric. Most of the deployments that you'll see come from the roots of CI, and that's a developer who wants to do their job better. So they have kind of self-selected this. And then lastly, there's this opportunity for what I'm calling here disassociated implementation. You don't necessarily get forced into a specific set of products. It's not a specific company. Jenkins is very happy to integrate with other things, and community members have created, thousands of plugins at this point for integrating with different solutions. And if you don't have it, it's relatively easy to extend it. This is an email that I got this morning. And it's about a workflow that they're looking to automate. And you can't see this in the back, I'm sure, but the underlined bit here says, it was the opinion of everyone on the call that Jenkins would be the ideal orchestration tool. We didn't tell them they had to use this. And then they asked, could we get a resource from your team to help us assess how what technologies we do and how we integrate all this together? Well, yes, we have a pattern for that. So actually pulling this off, we're going to call this the oversimplified approach. Negotiate, automate, and then orchestrate. So negotiations, this is between the teams. They've got to figure out the who and the what. Also, there's going to be established standards in a large enterprise. We have some restrictions that we just can't get away from. They've got to operate within those bounds. We aren't inventing those things. We'll foster those conversations, but they need to make those decisions between themselves. This artifact that I talked about that we want to have in an artifact repository, it's got to be complete, versioned, vetted, and also have a fully automated deployment that goes along with that. What I mean is we don't just want a jar file. We want a deployment framework that gets that jar file into the system. And I would say two very important resources for myself were, of course, Gene Kim and Jez Humble. They influenced me highly in this space, and there are way more experts along those lines, but CI/CD, continuous delivery, figuring out how to do a lot of these practices, that's already been done. We're not going to dictate how teams do that, but we certainly will encourage it. We just need that artifact. And then we have a component deployment. So now that you have the artifact, you have a script or a process that will deploy that artifact, we just want to wrap it in a Jenkins job. That pipeline could be tens of lines of code, right? It could be download the artifact from the repository, extract it, and execute the deployment script. It could be that easy. This needs to be repeated for everything. When I say everything, I don't just mean these application software. We're also talking about infrastructure, configuration, other aspects. So each of those discrete components, and each of those discrete teams, in our case we have separate teams, need to all do that on their own. And then we have another Jenkins job, which is really a wrapper around the whole process, and we call this our deployment orchestration. And when we get to this level, that's what gives us that semi-autonomous cross-functional orchestration. Each of the teams, while they do have to use Jenkins and they do have to use some type of consumable artifact, they have wide flexibility in how they get there. Once they have that, it makes it very easy to integrate these disparate technologies. So looking at the teams, we'll say we have an infrastructure team, a systems team, and an application team. So you need to provision, configure, and deploy your product. This, I should be clear, this is not our resources. This is a reference to the concept of flip the banana, because monkeys eat bananas upside down. They hold the stem, and it's easier to peel from the bottom. So that's how we empower the doers to do the job. If everyone has done these things and we have 3 tiers of automation, we can give that automation directly to the doers. In this case, the developers who know what their dependencies are. They need a specific deployment system in place to deploy their software. Well, now they have a call to an existing Jenkins orchestration that team put together, and they can call that as a stage within their overall pipeline. They can do the same thing for their configuration, as well as their own deployment of their software. That complete orchestration is another job that comes along. Development teams have control over this directly. So at a top level, developers can get really, really creative in the different workflows that they put together. And this just shows all the different stages in one of the jobs and all the parameters that they allow for kicking this off. But for one of the infrastructure teams, in this case, this is a chef deployment job, all the development team needs to do is provide a single configuration file, and that can be called, you probably can't see this, but you can look up the slides later, that can be called with just a few lines of script in the overall pipeline. So summarizing all of this, really comes down to putting people first. This whole movement is about the people that are a part of it. You're not going to inject DevOps into the organization. You're not going to force it upon anyone. You've got to find a way for them to internalize it, and you've got to find a way to work with all of the different stakeholders. Value is, of course, subjective. What works for us may not work for you. Don't cage the butterfly, right? You can try to find a way to make DevOps something that it's not, and you'll hear a lot of misunderstanding and interpretation in that space, that others will have tried to do these things. But the reality is, once you do that, once you force too much constraint, you'll miss what you're trying to accomplish. Organizational structure is very hard to change. Don't try to change it. Embrace whatever you have. You can try to change it, but if you're 10,000 people, that means our DevOps journey starts in 5 to 10 years, right? So figure out a way to work with what you've got. Offer both opinionated and non-opinionated solutions. And then, of course, enable and stay out of the way, right? This idea of this pasture-raised DevOps, right? Give them the space that they can do what they need to do, because they're the people who are going to be effective. And then negotiate, figure out the who and what, have each of those players automate their process in the best way they want to, and then put your orchestration on top of all of that. Don't start with the orchestration and try to shove everything underneath that. Thank you, everyone. So we have a few minutes here. Looks like 5 minutes, so I think that'll be perfect. I will answer as many questions as I can if there are questions.
So how do the test automation come in place in your partner?
So because we request that the artifact is produced, there's kind of an expectation that they're using best practices for creating that artifact. Now, theoretically, could they put a cron job in place that tarred up their repository? Sure. They could do something really generic, but that's not what we're looking for. We're expecting that development teams are embracing their own CI and CD practices and their own pipelines to vet and validate artifacts and vet and validate their products. So we have some support to help them directly with those things, but it really comes back to that's up to them, right? We can't force a development team to adopt a certain workflow. And if we tried, we have too many developers. We wouldn't be able to. There's too many development managers across the organization. So we encourage them to follow the leaders in this space, listen to the best practices that are well established, and do those things.
But do they contribute to the test so that when you go on production, they have some sort of automated test to run, make sure that the code is working?
We hope so. We don't require it at this time. We're maturing enough that we might begin requiring it. Because if people aren't having those automated, post-deployment validations in place, then there's a manual step of somebody's got to go out and make sure it's all functional. So we want to see them do that, absolutely. Yes.
How did you make decisions around those that were going to follow the opinionated part and those that were not opinionated before? The not opinionated part, how did you actually assess the success of the program?
So the question was, how do we determine whether they use an opinionated or a non-opinionated approach? I think first we don't dictate, right? We say, here's our opinionated solution. You will use this source control, this CI server, this repository, this deployment process, et cetera. We set that, and we say, if you like this, you can use it. If you don't like this, here are the important high-level milestones. And so long as you hit those milestones, we don't care how you get there, right? Get that artifact into the artifact repository, we'll call it good. Now, as far as assessing whether or not they meet criteria, we just decided that the organization is too large for us to be setting hard requirements for those types of things. So we expect that they're doing the right thing, but at the end of the day, if we weren't here at all, they would still be doing it in whatever wrong way they would be doing it. We don't think we're going to affect that. Right? We think the community, right, getting together with other like-minded people and saying, oh, hey, you do that, really? And you learn the right way to do things through bringing together all of the resources as a large community. But we don't assess or determine what the right solution is for them. We provide opinions, certainly, right? They'll ask us what we think about it and what we would suggest. But at the end of the day, it's kind of up to them to make that determination.
So, and as you have a diverse set of tools across your team, do you run into challenges with cross-training engineers?
It's not something that has been a real problem focus for us. I mean, certainly if you have developers who are familiar with one tool set and then they have to learn another, that can be very challenging for them. But we don't prioritize ensuring that that's okay. I think if you're having high turnover or people that are shifting around to different places, that's maybe a different problem that you have to worry about. I mean, but we have people coming on board and going to other places all the time, and that's just a natural part of the thing. Yep.
What kind of metrics you pull out of the existing service?
Sure. So we're actually looking at DevOptics, thank you. We're looking at DevOptics now to just kind of go with the defaults that they've got. I mean, of course, with Logstash, like the Elk stack, having all of that available, like we've started to dig into that. We have a team right now that wants to export that data and put it into Tableau and get very creative, but we're not really doing a whole lot with that at the moment. Yeah. There's a lot available, certainly, but we're not digging into it yet. All right, I think we're running out of time, but any other questions? Great. All right, thanks, everyone.